It was around 2 p.m. on December 31st, 1862, when President Lincoln, the nation's first Republican president, quietly slipped out of the East Room and walked upstairs to his office on the second floor. Waiting for him was Secretary of State William H. Seward. On the large table near the center of the room rested a document written out by a professional calligrapher and corrected a final time only hours before, after Lincoln himself noticed an error. Solemnly, Lincoln sat down at his accustomed spot at the head of the table. Now, at last, he would sign the most important order of his administration, perhaps of the century, the Emancipation Proclamation. Meanwhile, on the same day at midnight, before the Emancipation Proclamation was to be signed by President Lincoln, black slaves and freedmen gathered for watch nights to pray and intercede for President Lincoln that he would fulfill his promise. January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, declaring all slaves in Confederate states and territories in rebellion against the Union shall be thenceforward and forever free. People fell on their knees, singing, shouting, and praising the Lord. After the Emancipation Watch Night, it became a tradition of the Black Church on New Year's Eve to give thanks and celebrate God's intervention in ending slavery. Serious and intense recruiting began in January 1863 after the South failed to heed Lincoln's ultimatum. 175 regiments comprising of free blacks and former slaves joined the newly formed United States Colored Troop regiments, making up 10% of the Union Army. The United States Colored Troops fought in every major campaign of the war's final 2 years. President Lincoln, regarding their contribution, stated, "Without the military help of the black freedmen, the war against the South could not have been won." Frederick Douglass was instrumental in the efforts to form one of the first regiments in the North, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, of which his two sons, Lewis Douglass, a sergeant major of the 54th, and Charles Douglass, who would later become a first sergeant with the 5th Massachusetts Regiment, both served under Colonel Robert Shaw, the son of prominent abolitionists. However, all slaves did not hear of their emancipation. It was 2.5 years later, in June 1865, that a number of slaves learned of this proclamation. Black and white Union officers were dispatched to remaining plantations to read the Emancipation Proclamation aloud. Juneteenth, short for June 19, 1865, and 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, marked the day Major General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas, with 2,000 black and white federal Union troops to occupy the former Confederate state. It was on that day when General Granger announced and read the Emancipation Proclamation, General Order Number 3, and other orders at 5 different locations. The orders read and declared, the state of Texas illegitimate and Confederate soldiers and officials must report for parole. Cotton was to be sold with government oversight. General Order Number 3 continued to be circulated and reprinted by General Granger and his 2,000 troops throughout the Texas Gulf and East Texas, where the most concentrated population, about 40% of blacks, were at the end of the Civil War. Juneteenth, also known as Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, or Day of Jubilee, marks a celebration of over 150 years. On June 19, 1866, 1 year after the announcement of General Order Number 3, freedmen in Galveston, Texas, organized the first annual celebration of emancipation in the state of Texas. Juneteenth was signed as a bill in 1979 and celebrated as an official holiday in Texas in 1980. Generations of Americans continue to be inspired by the men and women who fought for freedom and experienced that moment of liberty on that day in 1865 through reenactments, parades, music, food, storytelling, and dance. We honor the courage, bravery, and the sacrifices, even of their lives, of those gallant soldiers and military leaders like General Granger, General Ulysses Grant, Colonel Robert Shaw, government leaders Abraham Lincoln, and those radical Republican senators and congressmen like Thaddeus Stevens, Senator Charles Sumner, North Carolina Governor William Holden, Congressman James Hines of Arkansas, who was assassinated in 1868 by the KKK for his stand against slavery, and abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth. This is just the tip of the iceberg. There were many more along with these, known and unknown, who left us all a legacy of freedom to remember.